Today, we're going to be talking about what flies to use during certain seasons that are going to be the most productive. Now, we're not going to talk so much on the specifics of flies, but more just the categories. So like streamers, dry flies, nymphs, terrestrials, wet flies. Now, I am going to group wet flies together with nymphs and terrestrials with dry flies just to kind of make it more simple. I'm going to try to make this video as simple as possible. Obviously, it can be a little bit technical, and you can really get into like the science behind it, but my goal today is just to help out those new to fly fishing and make it simple so they know what they're using is going to be productive during the time of year they're using it. Now we're going to start with summer, work our way to fall, then winter, and then spring. Now, during the summer, this is the time of year that you should be throwing dry flies and nymphs. Nymphs are always going to be productive pretty much year round. You're probably going to catch a lot more fish on nymphs just because fish feed under the water more than they feed above the water. But keep an eye out for consistently rising trout, because if you see that, that's the time to throw dry flies. I'll usually start off nymphing until I see like a pot of rising fish, and that's when I'll swap over to dry flies. Or if I just run a dry fly the whole time, I also like to use a dry dropper rig. That's where you have a pretty large dry fly up top, kind of like a big caddis fly, and then about 12 inches back, you can run a little nymph. Like I like to use like a green perdigon, and then you're fishing both worlds. You're fishing above the water and below the water. Now, one thing I like to do too with dry flies is I also like to run a dry dropper, but with a double dry fly. So kind of similar to the dry dropper rig, but instead of a nymph, we're running a second dry fly. So I'll do the front, I'll run a pretty large caddis fly, and then on the back, I'll run like a very small Quigley's cripple, and that usually does really good for me. Some fish come up and they hit that caddis fly, and some fish come up and they hit that Quigley's cripple. But that big caddis fly helps me see that Quigley's cripple. So if you're ever using like really small dry flies and you can't quite see it, tie it behind a big dry fly and that'll help you see it. And oftentimes you still catch fish on that big one. And then the cool thing is too, if that small dry fly sinks or gets kind of below the surface, a lot of times the fish will still hit it. And then you can kind of use that big dry fly as like a strike indicator, just like you would on a dry dropper rig. All right, now we're gonna work our way into fall. Now fall is a fantastic time of year to throw streamers. You can throw some pretty big streamers too, because those brown trout, they're getting really aggressive. That water's cooling down. They're more willing to chase a fly. Now you got to be careful though, because brown trout will start spawning in the fall, and you don't want to fish for spawning trout, and try not to step on their reds. I advise just kind of avoid shallow water in general when you're fishing during the fall. That can also be a good time to try stillwater fishing as well. Stillwater fishing can be a ton of fun. Throwing like balanced leeches under an indicator can be really effective once that water starts kind of cooling down on lakes. All right, now let's kind of work our way into winter. During the winter, I like to use streamers a lot, but I also use nymphs. Sometimes it just depends on the day. I have more luck on streamers than I do nymphs, or I have more luck on nymphs than I do streamers. So I just kind of switched up, see what's working, but streamers are still very effective during the winter, just like they are in the fall, maybe slightly less, but I like to mix it up from using like really big streamers down to just like really tiny like little jig streamers. Can do really good if the trout are picky. And I just kind of do slower retrieves. I'll do like really fast strips, but very short. So it keeps it a lot of movement, but doesn't move very fast. And I have a lot of luck doing that. And then for nymphs, I like to use egg patterns and midges. Pretty simple on fly selection when you're nymphing during the winter. Pretty much just eggs and nymphs will pretty much work almost the entire winter. Eggs will start kind of fading out towards the end of winter. They'll stop being as productive, but I catch fish pretty late in the winter on eggs, just on my home rivers, so I'll use them pretty much year round, but if it dies off, I'll just kind of switch to just using midges. And then as it starts to kind of warm up a little bit, as spring rolls around, that's when I totally stop nymphing altogether and I just throw streamers only. This is where I have at least on my rivers, this is where I have the most luck. With streamers, especially for targeting really large brown trout. Streamers they work really well. The water's warming up. There's not as much bug life in the water because, it's still just coming out of winter, so the bugs aren't quite as prevalent as they are during the summer. But that's just makes it a great time to throw streamers because the fish are hungry and they're active and there's not a lot of food source in the water at that time. So yeah, if you're trying to target big trout, use streamers, especially in the spring, and you should have a lot of luck. Now, this also is one of my favorite times to do ice-off fishing. That's when you go to still water and you try to catch it when the ice has just melted off the bank, so you have like 20 feet to like 30 feet of open water. Even once the ice is completely off, it's still good, but the best time is when you can catch that opening of water to the ice in the bank. That's when I have the most luck using like balanced leeches, and I'll use like chronomids and things like that. And like I catch some really big trout, and the fishing is very, very quick. So that's one of my favorite times of years for stillwater. But like I said, for rivers, streamers, all the way for spring. And then as it starts to kind of warm up even more, you'll start seeing a lot more bugs in the water under rocks, and you'll get a lot more dry flies on the surface. That's when I really like to start switching into like my summer mode, where I'm throwing those dry dropper rigs I was talking about and more like nymphing and stuff. Now, as far as like times of years to throw hoppers, I know a lot of people are interested in throwing grasshoppers. If you guys want to see my grasshopper video, I have it right here. This is Land of the Hoppers. This is from last summer. Me and my buddies, we just had a ton of luck on hoppers. Now I have the most luck on hoppers during July to August, September. That's when I generally have the most luck. Usually by October it slows down a little bit, but June is usually not the best time for hoppers. It just depends. When you start seeing grasshoppers all over the bank, that's when I start throwing grasshoppers. Now when the hopper bite is on, I don't like to run a dry dropper rig. Because dry dropper rigs are really good. I run them a lot, don't get me wrong. But when you're getting a lot of fish hitting the hopper and coming up for it, this is just kind of like a little pro tip. If you have a lot of fish kind of come up to it and then they just don't quite get it, or they kind of refuse it, I would just, if you're running a dry dropper, cut that bottom fly off, just use the hopper, because when they come up for it, sometimes they might actually hit the tag line from the nymph, and that might cause them to kind of turn away and not eat your hopper. Now, if you guys enjoyed this video and you want to check out more, check these ones out right here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.